Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for turning up today. I hope you've all had a great week. Most of the people already on the call have hopefully renamed themselves just saying where they're from. It'd be great to know where everybody is joining us from today. The session will hopefully answer a lot of the questions that you have, but feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat. We'll also be posting links there to keep you up to date. And if you do have any questions at any point, just throw them in the chat. We'll answer them at the end. We've got a number of people from the network joining us today, so we'll hopefully be able to give you lots of different perspectives on any questions that you do have. But our main talk will obviously be today from Patrick Brown. So I will hand over to Patrick, and hopefully you should have the ability to share your screen, and we will get cracking with today's presentation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Johnny, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this. Well, it's a very chilly Friday afternoon here in Northern Ireland. I'm sure it is everywhere at this time of the year. Hopefully, you're not all too zoomed out at the very end of the week. Hopefully this talk should last around an hour or so. Just wanted to go through a few bits of housekeeping before I get into introducing myself and the presentation. So wanted to be as discussion focused as possible. I am going to give a fair big long spiel at the start here, but please do pipe up with any questions or points of clarity if you want to ask them. I probably won't be able to see everyone on the screen, but I'm sure Sam, Johnny, Chiwe will help if anyone has their hand up or wants to put a question in the comments as well. Or just pipe up. It is quite a big group here today, almost 50 people online, I think, at the moment. Sam will correct me, but we won't be doing introductions for that reason, because it has been fantastic success in getting so many people together, and great work, Sam and Johnny, on that. I do hope the talk isn't too remedial. I'm very well aware that I'm on this call with many experienced basic income campaigners and councillors, elected representatives at different levels, and some members of the public as well. And the point of this presentation is really to give people an introductory idea and an idea of strategies around passing motions related to basic income at local government level. It's primarily tuned for elected representatives, but there's definitely plenty of takeaways for the general public as well. I don't intend to get into great detail around the massive benefits of universal basic income. Hopefully, if you're on this call, you're already sold on that, or most of the way there. I will say, on a personal basis, I am a councillor in Newry Morning Down in Northern Ireland, and have been for about 6.5 years. I spent my afternoon dealing with housing benefit and bedroom tax issues for several vulnerable constituents. I was dealing with it on a call right before this call started. So for me, the need for basic income has never been clearer. When you take calls like that, where you have vulnerable families who've been hit with a £1,500 or £2,000 bill in the mouth of Christmas for bedroom tax overpayments they didn't realise were being made in their name. So absolute nightmare, and another reason why it's so important that we look at alternatives like universal basic income. So a bit of background on myself. I've mentioned that I'm a councillor in Northern Ireland. I'm also the founder of the UBI Lab Northern Ireland, and a member of Basic Income Northern Ireland as well. And I'm also doing a PhD in basic income and conflict transformation. That's my niche at Queen's University in Belfast. And I suppose I've been put forward for this talk because I sort of touch on a lot of different things in the basic income world: the councillor political angle, the activist angle, and the academic angle as well. So sort of a combination of a few different things there. Not saying I'm by any means a huge expert. And as I said, there's plenty of other people on the call who've probably been campaigning on this for longer. But we have had a good bit of luck with quite a few motions passed in Northern Ireland over the last year. So I suppose that's the reason that I've been put forward on this. But as I say, at the end, we're going to have an opportunity for a wider discussion and hearing from people and sharing the wide range of expertise that I know is on this call. So to start off with, why local government? Why are we looking to go in and start passing motions at that level rather than devolved assemblies, Westminster, etc.? Here are some of the reasons we've got for that. So councils can act as hotbeds of ideas and grassroots activism. And they can help to shape and create political legitimacy for new ideas that maybe wouldn't get as much of a say or wouldn't be as easy to get on the agenda at a higher level in a legislative body. They can also send signals to people up the political hierarchy that this is something that local people in a particular area want to see explored, and that can send a message to legislators and wider political parties that this is something that they should take note of. There's also less barriers to access in the local council, so it's very easy for constituents to pick up a phone and speak to a local councillor. We tend to be closer to constituents on the ground on a daily basis, hearing about their concerns. So in that regard, it's sort of easier to get our ear and get us to do things and bring motions on things. There's also a lot of councils across the UK, which means there's a lot of opportunities to bring motions, to debate basic income and get it on the agenda, and overall try and create as much momentum to spread this idea as possible. There we go. Cool. So covered why we're focusing on local government. Why are we focusing on motions as our strategy within local government? Now, I will say at the outset, my political experience is very much biased towards Northern Ireland, so I don't claim in any way to be an expert on how local councils in England, Scotland and Wales conduct themselves, so I apologise in advance if anything I'm saying is sort of out of touch with what happens on the big island, as we call it. So I'm speaking primarily from my own experience locally, which hopefully is generally applicable for most local authorities. If anything, across the water, you guys have a lot more money and a lot more power than we do over here. So possibly you could do even more than what we are discussing and trying to advance here today. So why are we trying to encourage councillors and general public to pass a motion in support of UBI specifically? So first off, the primary aim is to raise awareness of the benefits of UBI. So it gives you a platform to go into a public body, into a public chamber, which might have live streaming capabilities to reach thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people. And raise awareness and debate and discuss the merits of UBI as you see it and how it can help your local community that you represent. As a result of that as well, it's much more likely to receive press coverage as opposed to other ways that it might be raised through a council setting. So for example, if someone were to speak positively about UBI in a committee session or bring an amendment or a proposal to a regular committee or full council agenda, it probably wouldn't or might not be picked up by the local press in the same way as a motion, which has much sort of greater legal standing, and the press tend to pay attention to motions a fair bit more in our experience. So there's a much greater chance to amplify what you're doing and get some press and social media coverage and so on as well. Motions are legally binding, so if they are decided by council, the council officers, the management team, however your council is set up, have to go away and deliver the actions within that motion. So a well-worded motion with concrete actions can have very solid outcomes that can help towards advancing, delivering, planning a UBI, however your motion is framed. That may not be the case in if, for example, you're supporting a UBI through an amendment or a proposal from the floor during a committee, etc. And finally, motions in general as a strategy are something that we as the UBI Lab Network are using to build momentum right across the UK for the movement. With councils are recognised as, they have a lot of credibility, they have a lot of weight, a lot of power within local communities. To see them talking about an idea like UBI adds a lot of credibility to the movement itself and improves our track record in terms of being able to advance our message out there right across the country. So for us to be able to say that X number of councils have passed a motion in support of UBI, if we're saying that to the press or any groups, anyone we're trying to persuade around the merits of basic income, being able to say X number of councils of local authorities have passed it really enhances our credibility and our ability to continue building the momentum for a basic income. Okay, so where have they been passed so far? Quick summary of some of the places that have passed a basic income friendly motion. And there's a lot of different varieties of motions that have come out of this, and I'm going to touch on how to word a motion in a moment. But very pleased that motions have been passed at government bodies right across the UK. Wales being a bit of an anomaly there, and they actually got the Senate done first rather than local councils, which is fantastic to have it coming in at that level right away, and that generated a huge amount of momentum in Wales as a result of that passing. A few of the major cities in England there, Liverpool, Sheffield, have passed, 4 councils in Scotland, and I'll talk a bit about the Scottish experience in a bit as well. And then Northern Ireland, of course, with 5, which relative to our number of local authorities is just over a third of all of our local councils. There is only 11 of them in Northern Ireland, so a pretty good track record for us, I like to think. Okay. There's a fair few questions coming in there, Sam. I'll just take a quick look and see. Grand. No direct questions. Cool. So as I mentioned, I'm going to pick up on Scotland specifically. I'm not just going to promote Northern Ireland here today, because actually Scotland got out ahead of most other regions on this and have done some fantastic work on promoting this. And apologies if there's any folks from Scottish councils who have passed basic income, because I'm probably going to give a very, very blunt and summarized view of what you guys have achieved already. But through some discussions with some folks over there, I've tried to learn as much as possible and tried to replicate the example of what has happened in Scotland already. So here's a quick summary of what Scotland have achieved. 4 local authorities, Glasgow, Fife, North Ayrshire and Edinburgh, all passed UBI friendly motions in fairly quick succession around the same time a number of years ago. I believe this was back sort of 2017-18 time they were being passed. They then formed a steering group of these local authorities, bringing in stakeholders from academia, Public Health Scotland as well, and used that group to lobby central government for funding for a feasibility study, which Nicola Sturgeon, the first minister, granted in 2020. Sorry, that's 2022. Yes, the feasibility study was completed in June 2020. That's a typo on my part, I believe. Apologies. That feasibility study has already been released, and I'm sure someone will share a link to it in the chat there if you want to look at that in more detail. It's a 250 page plus report, so only for the real hardcore amongst you to read all of it, but I would recommend giving it a cursory glance over, because it is a very impressive document which goes into a substantial amount of detail on analysis of trials worldwide, on the viability and feasibility of how a basic income trial would work in Scotland. So It's got some fantastic macroeconomic modeling as well, which may be of interest, so definitely worth a look over. One thing they did consider looking at, which no trial proposal has done yet, is behavioral modeling. So using a lot of qualitative research, survey data, interviews to try and look at, and behavioral economics to try and look at how people's behavior might change, how their social interactions might be altered as a result of a basic income being given to groups in a saturation site. I know that was something that the Scottish group looked at for a while and then moved away from. But that's something I just wanted to add in there that hasn't been looked at yet and could be considered in other feasibility studies potentially. I bring up the Scotland example because I think it's a good example that can be copied potentially in other regions. You could have a Southwest England, Northwest England, Yorkshire, Northern Ireland. We are looking at this as well. Steering groups with several local authorities in that region coming together to possibly part fund a feasibility study for their area. So if you have brought a motion, or you know of councils near you that have brought motions, banding together to try and advance the idea might be better than working individually. Okay, so how to word your motion. So this is what would then come out of the motion, hopefully being passed at council level. And the wording is crucial because it will dictate the actions that come out of the motion. Sometimes the motion is dictated completely by political feasibility. So what you think you can actually get passed, given the political makeup of your council area. So I've tried to break it into 4 main options there that are somewhat dictated by political feasibility. So a recovery or COVID-related short-term UBI is something that has got a significant amount of support right across the political spectrum. I mean, basically every party except the Conservative Party has supported that in some capacity over the last number of months. And that would be a UK government-led scheme to give money to people as a result of COVID to try and help households recover and to stimulate the economy in the more short term. And the outcome of that would likely be a letter to the Chancellor. And obviously being short term, it might be less of a political leap for many councillors in your area as well. So that could be seen as the easiest and probably very relevant in the current context we find ourselves in. Second, you could call on council to support in principle a full universal basic income. Again, this would likely be a UK-wide scheme ruled out by the UK government. So the most likely action would be writing to the Chancellor and asking him to introduce that. It's perhaps more of an ideological leap for some councillors because they might not be on board fully with the idea of a full UBI. So it's a step further. And as basic income advocates, that is ultimately what we want to see, a full UK-wide basic income. But it may not be on the agenda for some just yet. Third, supportive of local trials. Ideally with an action for council to play a direct role in that through setting up a steering group or a subcommittee of council, and writing to relevant authorities such as the Chancellor. In Northern Ireland, we have the Department for Communities who handle welfare issues. You could include DWP in that as well if you're in GB. And that is a sort of more concrete action for councils to take via a motion. We found that some councils in Northern Ireland have watered down that particular part because they don't want to spend officer time and council resources on advancing that, but they're more than happy to send a letter. Or you can finally word a motion supportive of all of those parts above, which is the one that we have been submitting in Northern Ireland, which is here in full. And as you can see, the first line focuses on the pandemic and the increased support for basic income as a result of that. Calling on Department of Communities, that's our welfare agency here in Northern Ireland, together with the UK Treasury to deliver a recovery basic income. Those first three lines are definitely less controversial and should be much more likely to get passed at a very wide range of councils, depending on their political makeup. The last paragraph is probably the most controversial, and what we have found some councillors in Northern Ireland and some parties have pushed back on and tried to amend. And that's the support of a full UBI and calling on council to produce a plan for how a pilot of that full UBI, how a pilot and a full UBI would be implemented within the district. So yeah, so that's the bit where we've normally run into barriers. My advice is to try and push for everything, try and get everything that you want, and then you can probably compromise on some of that if it comes down to it. Okay, so approaching councillors. This is more focused on constituents approaching councillors. If there are, I know there are several members of the public on here as well. There is a full UBI Lab network guide for members of the public approaching councillors. So I'll let someone share that in the chat there. That's much more detailed on this topic, so I definitely advise opening that up and give it a read. This presentation is obviously focused more on councillors themselves, but running very quickly through this. Try and start with councillors and parties that are already publicly supportive of UBI. So have they tweeted about it? Is it in their party manifestos? Have neighbouring areas passed it as well? That can be an interesting one. I think that was maybe part of the reason why there was Scotland and Edinburgh and Glasgow passing a motion in quick succession. I'm not sure who was first, but I think there was a bit of neighbourly rivalry going on there to pass motions, and that can sometimes be something to play up. If so-and-so area can have it, why can't our council? If you're approaching councillors, always good to try and get a inbuilt majority as soon as you can. So, if it's a Lib Dem majority council, for example, Lib Dems are supportive of basic income. It is their party policy, and so if you can get them to bring a motion to a Lib Dem majority council, then you're already 99% of the way there to getting that passed. So try and look at coalitions, majorities that you can approach to get the motion over the line before it's even been submitted. Recommend reaching out via email to your councillors. You can get in touch with the lab. We can provide some tips on how to word that email, how to frame it. And if you don't hear back from them, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and give them a call as well. You can usually find their contact details are publicly available. Try and offer a template motion. So I covered the one that we've been submitting in Northern Ireland there on the previous slide. Trust me, as councillors, it makes it so much easier if you do the work for us, and something we can copy and paste and change the wording of, change the name of the council in the motion, etc., where we need to, but make it as easy as possible for us. And there's a much better chance that it'll get picked up as a result. Or if you think they need a little bit more persuasion, if they're not fully sold on the idea of UBI just yet, invite them to discuss it further with you. So, you could arrange a Zoom meeting. If you have a local, UBI Lab network grouping, you could arrange a meeting with them via Zoom, or even ask them if you can come and present at a council committee. I did that in Derry and Strabane Council, where they had discussed the idea at a committee meeting, and then had themselves actually proactively reached out to the UBI Lab network and invited us to speak at one of their committees, and that then led to them pledging support for the previous motion there that we had on the last slide. So definitely don't be afraid to do that. If you do get an invite like that, link in with the Lab network guys, and we'd be happy to give you some advice on how to approach that. Okay, so you've got a councillor or a council grouping that is willing to take forward your perfectly worded, concise, concrete motion. You've got it submitted to Democratic Services or whatever the term is at your council. Now it's time to make sure that the other councillors, the other parties get in behind it. So what's the best way to lobby? And this is very much from the perspective of a councillor to councillor lobbying. So the public lobbying is obviously going to take slightly different routes. But yeah, once the motion is in, start lobbying other councillors as much as possible to back it. Ideally, if you can get councillors to sign up to the motion before it goes in and have that inbuilt majority, as I've mentioned, even better. But if that's not possible, then as soon as the motion is in and definitely getting discussed, get on the phone to as many of your council colleagues as possible. So they always say the most important thing in politics is to learn to count. So make sure you know what your route is to a majority in your council. Northern Ireland's probably a little bit more interesting in this, in that we have loads of different parties, so there's lots of different variations of math that can make up your result. And to be honest, we never quite know what way local parties are going to go on basic income, because there's a lot of parties just don't have a policy on it. So it tends to reflect the sort of ideological basis of the different local parties rather than a nationwide approach, which does make it quite interesting. And I know there are parties in GB that are in the same boat as well, where they haven't fully fleshed out their position on UBI. So it really is a case, and it really is important that you reach out to the other councillors on the full council meeting or committee that is going to be discussing the motion, and try and get a feel for where they are sitting on it. So pick up the phone, have a conversation with them. I find at this level, get them to tell you exactly what they're thinking on it. Don't send emails. Don't wait for them to get back to you. Keep ringing them, leave voicemails, send texts, try and get a direct contact with them until you can actually speak to them on the phone and find out where they're at with UBI. And try and ensure that you have a conversation with every party grouping on your council before the motion is debated. And even if that grouping is an independent or only worth a couple of votes on the council, still do it, because it means you are well aware of the votes you need to get it passed, or potentially any amendments that are coming over the line as well. And that gives you the chance to streamline any concerns that other parties might have, such as cost or officer time spent on the outworkings of the motion, or trying to incorporate any amendments if you're willing to accept them. And in Belfast City Council, we had a lengthy amendment from People Before Profit, just looking for a few different clauses on the motion, and we were happy to work with them to basically know that was coming from the floor on the night and accept it and as part of the motion, which was a great way of sort of knowing that we had the motion in the bag before we had started. If you're not succeeding in getting through to your council colleagues, though, and it's politics at the end of the day, and a lot of them might not be interested in taking a call or playing ball on this topic, they might just be completely ghosting you, then you can go down the more heavy-handed route of bringing in media coverage and trying to write to local papers and news outlets, and doing public lobbying as well. So getting stuff up on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, encouraging members of the public to write to them and lobby them to back this motion. And that worked fairly well in Newry Morning Down whenever we were bringing it, where we had quite a lot of interested constituents who were writing to councillors and saying, actually, this is an issue that I'm really interested in. I hope you'll consider supporting it. And I think that did end up winning a fair few of the more the parties who weren't so sure about basic income around. Okay, so when you're actually debating basic income in the chamber, a few key tips on that. I know it's teaching to suck eggs because you'll all be very experienced debaters in your own council areas. But if you do need some help on preparing speaking notes on some of the main lines of attack that you normally get on basic income, then UBI Lab is more than happy to help provide those. We've had some really crazy disses of basic income in some of our meetings. A certain councillor who said that UBI is all well and good for the frozen wastelands of Finland, but it simply wouldn't work in the UK, and all those sorts of strange lines of attack. We can help prepare you for all of those. We have speaking notes from other places where this has been debated, and a whole sheet of different counters to all of the standard lines of attack you get on basic income. We can also, where possible, try and give some live support. So if it's possible to tune into the council meetings, and I know that's usually the de facto norm at the moment in times of COVID, we can be online with you on WhatsApp or whatever, sending messages, listening into some of the lines of attack, so that if you're summing up at the end, we can give you some rebuttals to that. This relates to the point I previously made about the importance of trying to streamline things before it gets debated. And trying to know if there's any amendments likely to come in. Assume that if you haven't heard from another party before it goes to the debate, that they are either going to vote against it or bring in an amendment. So prepare yourself for that. Know where you stand in terms of compromising on what parts of the motion you're happy to give up and what you're not happy to give up. You know, if you 100% a trial is what you want to focus on, then don't accept an amendment which would take away that mention of a trial. If you think you're happy enough just supporting a recovery UBI or a full UBI in principle, then be prepared to accept that amendment. But the most important thing is try and think about what those likely amendments might be. We had an awful example in Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon Council, which wasn't included in the summary of councils that have passed a UBI motion, because they actually amended the motion to remove any mention of the word UBI from the motion. So it essentially was not a motion in support of UBI anymore, unfortunately. And that was actually a case where the councillors bringing it hadn't spoken to any of the other parties on that motion. All of the other parties had spoken to each other, though, and had agreed on that amendment before it came to council. So that was one that could have been managed better, and unfortunately got watered down significantly. But I think you can generally welcome amendments that add detail or clarity. So, that People Before Profit one in Belfast that I mentioned, they wanted things like, a UBI wouldn't, lead to cutting the minimum wage. We still think, investment in public services is the best way forward, but a UBI should be definitely looked at. And we were willing to take that because it was just adding, clarity or their particular, leanings around UBI to the motion. It wasn't actually damaging any of the outworkings of the motion. So that was a compromise position that we were happy to take. Sometimes motions can get sent to committee or to a working group. Sometimes that can be a positive way to try and analyze and debate and flesh out the detail of a motion. Sometimes it can be a way for officers and other parties to kill motions and try and get them out of the public eye. And I think we had a motion recently in the Northeast on that, which happened. I feel overall, the more UBI is debated in councils, the better. But it's very important that if that happens, the proposers of the motion don't just give up, that they use those committee or working group structures to continue flying the flag and debating and discussing UBI and trying to use those committees as a vehicle to actually get things done, rather than have the motion watered down. And if you're bringing that to a council and that happens to you, let us know and we can try and help with some of the strategies around that. Importance of media to your motion then. So media plays a really crucial role in bringing a motion on UBI, both before and after the motion is debated. Most importantly, before. It's about highlighting to the public that this is actually happening, and demonstrating to councillors that It's a newsworthy item. So, this is coming to your council, the media is watching, and how you vote is going to be scrutinised. That can be enough to get councillors to actually go away and read up on and come to a position on UBI. And if they can see that there tends to be a positive lean towards UBI in the media coverage, then that might also sway them towards backing it and not just dismissing it out of hand. Because the last thing us councillors want is an inbox full of angry constituents giving off at us about a particular way that we voted on something. After the motion is passed, press coverage is vital in terms of continuing to build momentum. So I know it can feel like once it's done, it's done, but it's a really crucial part of the strategy for us to make sure that every motion that is getting passed is getting publicised in the media afterwards and helping to build momentum, and that people who maybe aren't following council and don't know what's going on might read about it in their local paper or whatever. There's a lot of UBI talk in Guardian and Financial Times, but actually that local weekly paper that has a circulation of 5,000 or 10,000 people is arguably just as important, because it tends to reach a much wider demographic and expands the conversation around UBI in a very useful, valuable way. But I'm not the lead on media, thankfully. That is our man, Sam Gregory. His email is there. And if you have any media inquiries relating to UBI before or after a motion, or how to deal with the media, contact Sam, give him a shout, and he will help you out with that. Okay, so some next steps after your motion is successfully passed. So follow up in the press, I've covered this. Also follow up on social media, tag the UBI Lab network, tag anyone else you can think of, try and get as many retweets as possible. There might be social links there in the chat if possible on who to tag. You could write up a blog post for the UBI Lab network and have it publicised on our website and through our social channels. That doesn't have to be anything too extensive, just a bit about your motion, your local community, and why you think a UBI would be beneficial there. And it would be really useful in particular to get those local perspectives on why a UBI can be helpful. For example, in Northern Ireland, we talk about UBI as a peace dividend. So something that can help with conflict transformation in a post-conflict society such as here. I've mentioned this idea around steering groups and following the Scottish model on that. So look to what other councils in your region have backed a UBI and try and think about whether you could try and group officers and councillors from each of those together to collectively lobby government to put in place a feasibility study and bring forward funding for a local trial. It's going to be much more impactful when you work together, and you could always have 3 or 4 micro trials in different areas rather than one big trial. Speak to your council officers in whatever department is going to be responsible for the outworkings of the motion. In ours, it was the Enterprise, Regeneration and Tourism Committee, and ask them what they plan to do to progress the motion. And I actually had our head of that department come to me and say, look, Paddy, I've no idea what I'm meant to do with this. Can you give me a steer on it? Because I know nothing about UBI. And I said, don't worry, Connor, we'll be in touch in the next while as the UBI Lab, because we do have a plan in Northern Ireland for how we're planning to make the most of all of these councils passing a motion. And that is at the bottom there. We are setting up a steering group in the new year, bringing together as many of the councils who have backed it as possible. So we have 4 so far, and there's other ones that have motions in coming down the line very soon. From that steering group, we hope to bring together not just local authorities, but also some representatives from the Department of Communities who are responsible for welfare. We have Advice NI, which is the main benefits advice network on board, some academics from Queen's University, and ourselves, obviously, as the lab. And from that, we're hoping to lobby directly to Department of Communities and the UK government for funding for a feasibility study, just like in the the Scottish example. We already have a proposal for a trial for a peace dividend for Northern Ireland. That document, maybe someone will be kind enough to share in the chat there. That's something that we published fairly recently as a blueprint for how we would like to see trials progressing. But really one of the main conclusions was that we need a feasibility study to the same professional degree as the Scottish one before we can realistically start talking about trials. So that document is really the foundation for how we plan to go about doing that. So once we got the feasibility study done, hopefully it's going to be fairly easy to get the trials delivered. I joke because that is probably the most difficult part in terms of getting the funding together to run a trial. We estimate in our proposal that a trial could cost anywhere from 4 million to 300 million, depending on how much you give and how many people you give it to. 4 million is not a huge amount of money, though, for a government in the grand scheme of things. Unfortunately, we do have a government at the moment who have pretty much ruled out UBI completely at Westminster level. We do have a bit of flexibility in Northern Ireland around welfare that other devolved nations don't have, however. But ultimately we are going to need support somewhere along the line, probably from the likes of DWP and the UK government. But what we can do in the meantime is have a shelf-ready feasibility study for exactly how we are going to deliver these trials when funding becomes available. And then, of course, once the trials have happened, it's very easy to move on to a nationwide rollout of basic income, because, of course, you have all of this wealth of incredibly valuable and conclusive data about all of the positives that basic income will bring. Okay, so moving on to Q&A and examples of other motions on UBI that have been passed. I believe we have one person on the call, to my knowledge, who's willing to chat for a couple of minutes about their own experience, if Jamie from Norwich is there. And then we'll move on to a Q&A from everyone. Sorry, you've been listening to me talk for 45 minutes. I do apologize.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes, all good, Jamie. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that, Paddy. It's really really good overview. Yes, as Paddy mentioned, we in Norwich had during the summer in July had actually 2 motions on UBI come to our council. One was a Green Party motion which I proposed, which was directly calling for a UBI pilot, so sort of along the lines of the original motion that was passed in Sheffield by the UBI Lab Network. And I would really recommend actually anyone who is on here and is thinking about putting a motion on UBI to get in touch with the UBI Lab Network if you're not already, because that's really helpful to have that support, especially on the press coverage as well. And the other motion was by the Labour councillor Karen Davis, which was one on food poverty and included UBI in that. And really to get to that point where we had 2 motions on UBI, it was a case of sort of building awareness over a couple of years. So originally 2 years ago, there was an amendment to a separate Labour motion on the gig economy about UBI. So this was in a way similar to what Paddy was saying about some, being able to take things to a committee. I think that recommended it goes to a committee, and in that case, it was a sort of it meant that it didn't get the same coverage, but it meant that that it was a starting point that meant that we could then it was already in the council's awareness and consciousness, and then sort of things were quite quiet. It came to scrutiny committee. We had a briefing about that, and then during the pandemic, when coronavirus hit, and suddenly there was a sort of great deal more awareness of it. I, together with some of the other people who are on this call, actually with Jordan and some others, we set up UBI Lab Norfolk, and held an event, a speaker event in June with our local MP Clive Lewis, with local businesses, with local benefits advisors and disability rights advisors, which really was the intention was to show the sort of broad range of support that's out there for UBI, and invited all local councillors to that, to sort of start off that process of educating, and then encourage people to go out into their communities and talk to people that they knew about UBI as well. And as a result of that, now, in the before April, really, UBI was something that the council was aware of, but nobody really talked about very much. In the last few months, we had a council meeting on Tuesday, and UBI was mentioned at least 3 or 4 times on separate occasions on different topics, on poverty, on a Green New Deal, transition, and in regards to food poverty again. And it's now being mentioned all the time, and it's also one of the things that we included in, or I included in my motion, the Green Party motion, was to push the council's partners as well. So we contacted the local MPs, we contacted the Good Economy Commission, which is a sort of separate independent economy commission that we have in Norwich. We contacted the council's 2040 vision partnership, so which includes other local employers and social enterprises, and really sort of trying to broaden that conversation. And I think that's another key point of what councils can do is, we are sort of local leverage points and can open up conversations and talk to other groups and use that platform to raise awareness and increase the pressure, really. Yeah, that's a sort of summary of where we are.
Great stuff. Thanks. Thank you so much, Jamie. So I know there's a few questions in the chat there, and I'm going to open it up for broader discussion as well. Unless I just wanted to check, is there any other councillors on the call who have already passed a motion and would like to feed back on their experience? Assume not. That's grand. We only had Jamie lined up for sure, so that's all grand. Just looking over some of the questions there. In terms of Gilbert, do local authorities have powers to trial a UBI? No, not really, not themselves. It's probably not going to be that feasible for them to do any significant sort of UBI. It really depends. I mean, in theory, a council could, give £100–200 to every person in an area relatively easily. We tend to, as a UBI Lab network, talk about a much more substantial UBI that would replace certain work means tested benefits, work-related benefits. So that sort of UBI is going to need sign off from DWP, which is something that councils can't do themselves. So there's going to need to be partnership working. But we very much frame it as councils can be the spark from which a UBI trial can happen, but they shouldn't and probably won't be the main people delivering it. Although if a council wanted to, definitely worth exploring.
Can I just come back on that just very briefly? Sorry, I'm from Hackney, Hackney Borough Council in London. I know that a motion's been brought to the GLA, and obviously, we've got that sort of situation down here with 33 different boroughs. If the GLA took it up, do you think that it would be easier for boroughs to then trial it?
GLA, sorry, I'm not familiar with the term.
The Greater London Authority.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, possibly. It's probably something that we should discuss. I mean, I say, my experience is very much biased towards the Northern Irish councils who do work on a shoestring budget. I mean, I know that the Stormont executive has less financial powers than some English councils. So that sort of says a lot about where we are at in terms of the feasibility of a UBI trial locally.
Can I just come in on that very briefly? Sort of in answer to 2 of those questions, one about local councils not possibly having the power to pilot themselves, and that's partly because in the UK, unlike in other countries, there's almost no way of doing a pilot without HMRC and DWP involvement, and as we all know, they're completely centralised from Westminster, and that would need the Chancellor to give his blessing to that. Even if it didn't require the central government to spend any money, it would still require HMRC and DWP to basically exempt the people in the pilot from the usual tax and benefit system, which would kind of warp the results of the pilot. On the London boroughs thing, it raises a really interesting thing. The one way I keep thinking of that you could do some sort of pilot without central government, and central government have already said in an email to us from the Treasury last week that they have absolutely no intention of cooperating on UBI pilots. The one way I think that you could do it, which London could be open to London boroughs, is doing micro pilots with groups of disadvantaged people who are already using council services. So, for example, could you do a pilot with care leavers where people already have so little that they fall under the personal allowance anyway, so it doesn't make any difference to their the amount of tax they're paying? Could you see what happens if instead of just being let out completely on their own, care leavers are given £100 a week or whatever it is, and you could spend some of the money currently spent on the sort of support infrastructure, and you just give them the money? And I think that's something with inequality and poverty being so extreme in London boroughs, I think that's something where you could have more political legitimacy for piloting that in a London borough than you would get in the rest of the UK. So I think that would be a really interesting thing for London boroughs to explore.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, on the feasibility stuff around DWP, HMRC, that was the main conclusion of the Scottish feasibility study, that would be probably their main barrier. Northern Ireland, we actually are a little bit different in that regard, in that we can somewhat change our welfare setup, but we have to cover everything, all of the additional expenditure ourselves, and we are already fairly cash strapped at executive level, so that's why feasibility would be an issue here. I suppose to look across the water to America is a good place to start in terms of city-based trials, perhaps. And I haven't spent much time talking about individual trials or anything, and maybe that's a conversation down the line whenever you've all passed a motion, hopefully. But there is a UBI lab, not this UBI lab, but another UBI lab at Stanford University that have developed a cities toolkit on passing sort of municipal UBI trials and running them, and Stockton in California is probably the best example of that, where they give £500 a month to, I believe, 200 local residents. So maybe someone could share a link to that one as well. Gilbert, you can check that out. Just looking at some of the comments in here, is it Gilly or Gilly? Fully take that on board around the basis of why we should pass a UBI motion in the first place. I suppose I made the decision to focus on the more technical stuff and the outworkings or the logistics of a motion, rather than the sort of reasons why UBI, on the assumption that most people on the call are broadly supportive. But I think when we circulate the slides, we'll try and come up with 3 to 5 reasons why UBI is something that you should try and roll out in your local communities. But it's always good to have that local angle if you can. If you represent a particularly deprived community, an area that has suffered from welfare reform or as a result of austerity. In Northern Ireland, I used the example of the Peace Dividend and so on. So always good if you can get that local angle. Where are the cross-party supported ones in cities? Sam, maybe you could advise on. Okay, so in the Northern Ireland example, all of our motions have been cross-party, except the Armagh, Banbridge, Craigavon one, which failed, which I think is a very good example of the importance of trying to get someone else's name on the motion before you put it in. So it was mostly Alliance and SDLP. In one council it was Alliance and an independent member. So cross-party, if possible, is always the way to go, because then you know you've got those 2 voting blocks on board. But before you start, has a Conservative controlled local authority passed a UBI motion, Sam? I don't think so.
No, but the Conservatives in Hull voted.
Oh, yeah.
The minority Conservative group in Hull voted in favour. Here in Sheffield, the sole UKIP councillor at the time voted in favour because he said he thought it sounded really interesting, and the Lib Dems voted against. It just shows you get wildly different results depending on where you are, based on the political persuasions of the parties in that area. And to be frank, another thing that comes up quite a lot is if the parties absolutely hate each other on a certain council, like they do in a couple of hours, like they do in Sheffield, then the groups are likely to vote against it just because Labour hate the Greens hate the Lib Dems, etc., etc. Whereas if you get a council like, from what I can see, like Norwich, where there's a reasonably good working relationship between the parties, they're a lot more likely to kind of come together on stuff.
Yes, never hesitate to exploit those sort of local rivalries or ideologies. One thing that I used with unionist councillors in Uri Morning Down, for example, when I Sinn Féin pulled out of supporting the motion at the last minute, so I knew I had to get the unionists to either abstain or vote for. So I rang them up and made a case that actually if a UBI was rolled out, it would probably strengthen the union. Now, that's not necessarily my personal view on a UBI, but in a similar way to how the National Health Service actually has strengthened the union in a way, a national UK-wide UBI could, in theory, also have that impact. It's not an argument that I'm, putting out there and shouting about a lot, but it was something that was able to win them around to a particular angle of UBI that maybe they hadn't thought about that much. In terms of Sinn Féin as well, there's an example of a party that has voted 4 different ways on UBI at 4 different councils. So they voted against it in Uri Morning Down. They voted for it in Derry and Strabane. They abstained in Causeway Coast and Glens, and they amended it or tried to amend it in Belfast and Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon. So that's why it's important to always try and chat to people beforehand and get what way they're leaning on it. Just because they've put out supportive stuff on Twitter in the past, and just because actually they've rejected the idea publicly in the past, doesn't mean they won't vote for it when it actually comes to a debate. Yes, Gilbert, we can definitely circulate all of those links to you. We'll try and pull together a collection of resources to send out to everyone on the call. And yeah, I appreciate there's a fair bit of stuff to take on board. So look, I mean, the lab is there to sort of help people navigate this practically. And this, more than anything, is a introductory call to try and touch base with you guys and build a network of councillors that are willing to bring this forward. Metro mayors, there was a question on that. Sam, I don't think Johnny Ross Tatum's not on the call. Maybe you or Johnny know more about that than I.
Yeah, we've been kind of metro mayors is something we've been concentrating on in the last few months, and we think you can see that with Andy Burnham recently, they're becoming much more prominent in kind of in creating political legitimacy for certain ideas in the UK, because they can stand up and they can say, the Westminster way of doing things isn't working for people in Manchester, or isn't working for people in Liverpool or these big cities. So we've been working on each kind of case-by-case basis, and in the last few days, actually, we got support for pilots from Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, who's confusingly the mayor of Liverpool, and Jamie Driscoll in Newcastle. And we're sort of designing a bit of a campaign at the moment for the next mayoral elections. We're going to have a pledge that every candidate can sign, with the idea that all the Green candidates will sign up straight away, and then we'll try and build on that to get the Labour and the Lib Dem candidates involved as well. And I think metro mayors also, they potentially have the budget to at least commission a feasibility study. Like I don't think Sheffield City Council have any spare money at all to commission a feasibility study into a pilot, but Andy Burnham's office possibly do, or maybe they could work with Liverpool City Region, and they maybe do. So So yeah, metro mayors is definitely an area we're moving into.
Okay, just some interest in blockchain related experiments. To be honest, it's not something I've looked into in any great detail, but I am aware of the conversation. I don't know if there's any experts on the call who know much about blockchain.
We definitely have connections to quite a few people in the US that are really quite interested in that. I think for us in the network, the focus at the moment is getting people to understand what basic income is and see the value in it. And then once we've kind of overcome that hurdle, we can start to talk more about some of the delivery mechanisms that might facilitate getting people as an entire population en masse money into their hands and making sure that it does go to the individual and not the household. But yeah, if you want to bob me a message in the chat, I'm happy to point you in the direction of some of that stuff.
This question on UBS and versus UBI, and this is something that Sinn Féin that I mentioned would be in support of instead of UBI. And they feel that UBI could be framed as a neoliberal Trojan horse to sort of cut public services, and people just get their few £100 a month and that's it, and everything else is stripped back. I suppose as a network we've never come at it from that angle. We've come at it from that angle of a UBI fixes or fills the gaps that already exist within the system, but it's no substitute for investment in good public services, and we should absolutely be doing both. And putting money into education, health service, etc. I suppose my issue with UBS is it's sort of inherently paternalistic in terms of it's telling people what they need to live a good life, in terms of giving them the resources to make that choice themselves. And I always use the example of representing a fairly rural constituency. There's no farmers in my area that are going to benefit necessarily from free public transport. But they could probably do with a few extra quid every month to pay their bills. So a UBS is just trying to get a one-size-fits-all strategy for things that won't necessarily have an equal benefit. That plus the paternalism is why I don't support it, whereas UBI is all about giving people choice. Just to touch on the micro pilots point as well, I was on a call about the proposed Irish trial. So in the south, in the Republic, and they're talking about an artists and creatives UBI trial, so focused specifically on that group, and I suppose recognizing the impact that COVID has had on them and so on. So that's another example of a micro pilot that could be proposed.
I'd love to hear people's ideas for more of those micro pilots thing. It's an idea I'm completely obsessed by at the moment, and if anyone's got any other ideas of groups of people that local authorities could conceivably pilot, just with it could be an incredibly small, it could be 12 people. If you can draw stories out of it, then it's worth doing.
Yeah, a lot of those micropilots are all about that qualitative anecdotal evidence. There's one in Mississippi with African-American single mothers on low incomes. There was one a long time ago that Guy Standings talked a lot about with homeless individuals. And then, well, I suppose the Finnish one was quite large scale, but that was with unemployed individuals. So lots of different sections of society that could be looked at. I think care leavers is a fantastic one, and you just have to look at the data in a lot of the North American trials around young people, particularly young men, staying in education as a result of getting their UBI, to see the benefit that could bring. Any other questions from the floor?
I have switched it so everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. So rather than us try and scan across for all the windows and raised hands, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question if you do have one.
Hi. I do have a question about procedure, because we're the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, and we don't currently have a majority on the council. It's a narrow Conservative majority with of independents and Lib Dems. I'm Lib Dem myself, not councillor, activist. What strategy do you suggest in that situation?
I would have a conversation with some of the Conservative members that you perhaps know are more open-minded, liberal, Conservatives from a more sort of libertarian background, for example, might be more open to the idea of UBI, or maybe they have a bit of a rebellious streak and they're not so willing to take the party line. Maybe they operate at a local level more like independents who happen to be called Conservatives. Those are the sort of members you want to be trying to have a conversation with first, and not necessarily expecting that they will, sign the motion, but trying to get a feel from them as to whether they might abstain or vote for the motion if it were to come. If you can, if it's a narrow majority, I don't know the number, but if you can peel a few Conservative votes off to abstain and cancel out the majority, then with your minority of supporters, you can probably get it over the line. So that's the strategy that I would probably advocate. Or hope that a few of them don't turn up on the night when it's debated. I mean, that's always a factor as well. People might not actually be. If it's a very narrow majority, that could make the difference as well. Or another thing to bear in mind, if it goes to a committee or even at full council, if your chair has a casting vote under standing orders, if it's really tight, if the chair of a committee happens to be from a different party, that may not be the case in England where you have sort of majority run councils, but in some places it will be the case where the chair could break a tied vote. Feel free to shout out if there's any more, or else we'll.
I'm gonna have to go in a sec. It's just a little bit about the scrutiny committee idea, and I think Newcastle was mentioned. Please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. I think Newcastle went a motion, and then it was amended to go to scrutiny. I think the same happened with London. Sean Berry brought that there. So what we're doing in Darlington, because we're a very small unitary authority, we'd have to probably go Tees Valley wider. And we've had a great chat with Sam already on this topic. And so what we're trying to do is we're going to try and do it the other way around. We're trying to go to scrutiny first to say, hey, there's this great idea called UBI, but we don't really know enough about it. How about we all look at it together? And then we'll have an idea about building a coalition. We've got Lib Dems who are newly on board and quite excited about it. We've got Greens and minority and Labour, just like the Tories, they're really a coalition. And I think there's a majority in our local group that may be willing to support. So we thought, just like Patrick was talking about coalition building and exploring people, this kind of puts it out there a bit and it's a bit more upfront. And we're hopeful that in the new year, we'll have a quick task and finish group to look at it, and then maybe move a motion, but we'd then have to coalition build throughout the Tees Valley as well. So it's a lot of work, and I'm really glad you guys have got our back with the support we've had so far is great. So hoping to make a difference on that in the Northeast.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I think to some degree, motions can be a blunt tool at times, and use with caution if there's definitely not a majority there on the council for it, and you feel giving it more attention at a scrutiny committee or working group level would yield more results. And whilst it may not get the press attention of a full motion, it does give constant opportunities to have it debated and on the public record. But most importantly, it's about building that evidence base. And if we have a whole host of councils across the UK who are analysing this in detail and trying to think about how UBI could apply or be delivered in their local communities, that is building a load of very, very useful information for hopefully when it does come to wide-scale trials and a national rollout of UBI. So any of that work that can be gathered is invaluable.
Brilliant. I think we'll officially draw things to a close. We can hang around on the call for an extra couple of minutes if people do have any additional questions. But I just wanted to say, obviously, an absolutely massive thank you to Patrick for pulling this together and sharing all your experiences and passing on the advice. Very, very much appreciated. Thank you for that. Thank you to the rest of the team, so Sam and Chiwe, for supporting, and Jamie for coming along and giving us that perspective from their experience in Norwich. If, as has been mentioned on a number of occasions, you would like any help, advice or support or connecting up, or just to kind of talk about this, as has been said a number of times, the real trick to this is kind of doing the prep work and kind of easing into it and making sure everybody's sounded out and understands what's going on, rather than the rushing in. That definitely does seem to be the single most deciding factor, is to do the groundwork. So please feel free to get in touch. You've got our contact details. We hopefully are pretty easy to find, but we'll draw things officially to a close now. We'll stop the live stream on Facebook. If any of you do have any additional questions, we can hang around for a few minutes. But otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your Friday and enjoy your weekends. Thanks very much for coming.